question answers. Just listen to the recordings once again and keep your questions ready. Right. Today, this is the second lecture of the Ramanujan course. And we will discuss 3 poems today. And I'm projecting the poems right now on your screen so that we can quickly take a look at them while we discuss them. Is my screen visible to you?
Yes, sir.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the first poem that we'll discuss is a river, which is a very well-known poem taken from the Striders, the collection of poems of the first collection of poems of Ramanujan. And the Striders is also in many ways a very remarkable poem because it shows the technique of Ramanujan, the early technique of Ramanujan at least. Remember what we've talked about when we suggested that in Ramanujan, the image is paramount in the sense that the image is the source of the poem, and the sharpness and the cutting edge with which the image is described, it's foregrounded. But at the same time, we've also talked about the Akam and the Puram poetry in the sense that the image then, or the body then, leads on to further images of nature, culture, and it is here in this linkage between the Akam and the Puram that the irony of the poem is brought out. So there's a very conscious stitching and unstitching of meaning in the sense that there is the image and then there is the idea. And the image and the idea are held in a taut tension. But Ramanujan's poems almost always begins with the image. And therefore, the river is the image of the river Vaigai in Vaigai, the river Vaigai in Madurai, which flows through Madurai and drops into the Arabian Sea. Now, interestingly, the Vaigai has a legend associated with it, and that is a legend that is associated with Shiva. And the legend is that there's this woman who falls in love with Shiva and wants to marry him, and the father refuses. So it's a kind of take on the Sati story. So these are numerous small narratives which are spread across different parts of India, which reflect one great, one rather similar narrative in the other part of the country. And the legend goes that the king invites Shiva and shows the great wedding feast that he has arranged for his daughter. And then Shiva calls a Rakshasa and says that he can eat up your entire feast. And the Rakshasa eats up the entire feast and then is very thirsty. So Shiva opens his jata, as it were, the curled hair, and from that hair flows the river. And therefore, it becomes a river which once you open your hands gives water. Vaigai is the river or the source that keeps on giving water. So this is the myth and the legend which is associated with it. Madurai is, of course, known as the city, the sweet city, as it were. Madurai is the city of culture, of ancient literature and culture. And therefore, this river Vaigai and Madurai are both very significantly mentioned in the Sangam literatures. Now, while Ramanujan did fall back upon the Sangam literature, his pervasive irony also took a look at the inadequacies of Sangam literature, the inadequacies of literature in general. So this is question of how literature is related with life. And Ramanujan also is interrogating to what extent Hinduism as a religion, or the Brahminical Hinduism, is, as it were, concerned with the lower strata one, and secondly, how is it concerned with daily life? How does it answer the the crisis of daily life. So there are two themes here. The first theme is the disparity between poetry and life. And the second is the disparity between organized religious beliefs and its imperviousness to ordinary life. And of course, the entry into these ideas is brought out through this poetic technique of foregrounding a very sharp image, right? So that is the image with which the poem begins. In Madurai, a city of temples and poets who sang of cities and temples. So there is this always tension between the past and the present. So past history and present conditions are always brought together. So there's this movement within time. Remember Ramanujan working in Chicago, writing about Sangam poetry, translating it, and also writing his own poem. So modern poets and ancient poets, modern poetry, ancient poetry. So Madurai, the city which is ancient, yet modern, city of temples and poets, as I pointed out, it was a seat of culture, who sang of cities and temples. And then you see that image, that very sharp image. Every summer, a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand ribs, straw and women's hair, clogging the water gates. Now, this is a very familiar but very urgently realistic image in the way that maybe Ezra Pound would have written, right? You can just travel across to the river Ajoy, and on the bridge of the river Ajoy, you can probably take a look at the exact similar thing that is happening now, bearing the sand ribs, straw and women's hair, the river drying to a trickle. This is a very familiar image that we have, don't we? At the rusty bars, clogging the water gates at the rusty bars, under the bridges with patches. Once again, this image of the bridges with patches, the iron bridges which were built probably during the colonial era, is again a city of temples and poets of the ancient age coming into coexistence with the city of the modern age, of the colonial age, where bridges are erected over the river with iron and rusty bars of repair all over them. So the bridge is frequently repaired. The wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. So you'll see these stones rising in the water, which are covered underwater when the river is in spate. But when the river has dried up, there are two very important metaphors here. Wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, and the dry ones, shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. So ancient, stones like ancient religion, lounging in the sun, as it were, they exist, but they do not matter. That is what Ramanujan tries to say, that, well, is questioning as to whether really the ideas received by an organized religion do matter, or do they not matter at all? Or do they just, exist like crocodiles and buffaloes? And then comes that line where, in spite of the dryness, in spite of the total lack of water, what the poets only sang is of the floods. The poets only sang of the floods. And these poets are not only modern poets, these are also ancient poets. So both sets of poetry are, as it were, cut off from the very roots of life itself. And then he talks about the poet. He was there for a day when they had the floods, right? So the poet can write only about the force of nature, one cataclysmic event, but he cannot write about daily existence. People everywhere talked of the inches writing, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by this water, rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda as usual. Now, you can always see the irony in those lines. The water carrying off a pregnant woman who is unnamed, but the cow is named Gopi and Brinda, of course, referring to the cult of Krishna, and how the cow now becomes more important and named rather than the pregnant woman who is unnamed and lost. Right? Therefore, in a sense, this is a very ironic look at the way in which our stories, our legends prioritize the concept of a religion which prioritizes the cow, the Gopi and the Brinda over the pregnant woman who is lost and unnamed. The new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman drowned, with perhaps twins in her, kicking at the blank walls even before birth. So is this a critique of a poetry which does not speak about protest, but which only talks about the celebration of nature? Now, is this Ramanujan in 1960s writing about a poetry of the earlier Romantic age, when nature is seen as a great benevolent force, when nature's poetry is seen as sublime? Is Ramanujan therefore trying to bring in the tradition of real poetry, or realist poetry, not real poetry, every poetry is real poetry, but realist poetry which sort of foregrounds the problem of the ordinary? Right? You'll remember when Nissim Ezekiel writes about the night of the scorpion, he talks about the very commonplace mother who will then only bless the fate that it bit herself and not her children. Similarly, Ramanujan is also the poet of the commonplace and the poet of the people who shows how in our poetry, the cow named Brinda and Gopi is much more important than the pregnant woman with twins inside her who were kicking for birth. Now, if you take this a little further, and if I read this a little deeper, then Ramanujan is writing at the time of at a time when just independence has taken place, and these unborn twins, are they, metonymic representations of the midnight's children who will be born later on? Right? Is this the new destiny of India waiting to be born, yet swept away by the flood, and nobody really talks about them? Right? So Ramanujan's question is whether, even in independent India, the commonplace citizen does really have any kind of mention or place in conventional history and literature, or is the literature still part and parcel of an elite culture which elides over the sufferings of the common man while referring to the cows that have been lost, naming Gopi and Brinda? He said, the river has had water enough to be poetic about only once a year. So this is a refrain again. It carries away in the first half hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and 1 pregnant woman expecting identical twins. So you see, this is the earlier poet, and this is the more modern poet, and both of them sing identically. They have no there is no, as it were, modernity in the writings. They merely refer to the 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and 1 pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no molds on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart. Now, very interestingly, if you look at these two stanzas, the second and the fourth, you will find that they are identical twins. identical twins are really the poets, with different colored diapers, with different time frames to tell them apart, yet they are speaking of the same, in the same refrain, of the same fate of ordinary men, or ignoring the fate of ordinary men, and speaking of the spate and the poetic aspect of the river, rather than the suffering and misery it causes to the young women. So, is therefore Ramanujan sort of condemning or critiquing or exploring the disjunction between poetry and life that you find in many literatures, right? Therefore, is he calling for a literature that is more sensitive to the misery and the plight of the human, rather than talk about the cows named Gopi and Brinda and the floods that are so important for literary sublimity? That is what this poem is all about. So the poem begins, as it were, with a very concrete image of a river in flood, of a river not in flood, rather, river in flood only once a year, but that once a year even becomes the subject of poetry rather than the daily humdrum life of ordinary men and women. So the poem begins with a very distinct, specific image. And then, and Ramanujan develops that image, but within that image, it broadens out into a Puram poetry that asks questions as to whether literature, both modern and ancient, is disjuncted from life, and whether, you see, these two poets, the traditions of poets, are identical in the sense that they are separated by time, but they sing only of the floods rather than common modernity, than common modern and miserable human existence of the ordinary people, right? So is this going to be the literature of the just born nation, is a question that Ramanujan is asking. And I say this with some urgency because both Ramanujan and Nissim Ezekiel are calling for a revaluation, calling for a certain new idiom which will focus on the common person, the common individual as hero, and his or her tribulations, right? Therefore, moving away from a glorified concept of literature, Ramanujan, as it were, is calling for a more subaltern kind of literary description. Now, you might find this a little difficult, considering that it comes from a poet who is writing based in Chicago. But at the same time, remember that Ramanujan is forever talking about the smaller traditions, the little traditions of literature, rather than the great traditions of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. He's talking about the little Ramayanas, where Ram is the god of the people, and he is to him the misery of particular people and particular cultures are addressed. Now, yesterday I referred to the poetry, the essays of Ramanujan, and his essay title is there, An Indian Way of Thinking. And I'd invited you to read it, and you'll have found that Ramanujan is talking about contexts, specific contexts of earlier literature, which have been lost largely with the advent of a modern literature. Even in this poem, I'm suggesting that Ramanujan is talking about Madurai, is talking about a specific contextualized river Vaigai, with its myths and legends associated with it. And you can notice the irony here. The Vaigai is the river which gives, but in this case, it is the river which takes. And if the mythical original is that it is always a river of plenitude, then in this case, it is a river which has dried down to a trickle, right? So all these factors, the image moving into the idea, the past and the present linked together, the stillborn nature or the unborn nature of the potential of a vast population of India, and the disjunction between high culture and the contemporary subaltern population are themes which Ramanujan, as it were, floats in this particular poem. So therein lies the poetic craft of Ramanujan, the foregrounding of the image, the ironic stitching and unstitching of time, and overall a broader ironic mode of communication, which calls into question what literature is about and how an entire nation, through its legends, has always neglected a certain percent of the population. Now, it is with this that I'd like to move on to the next poem that I want to discuss here. And this is a poem on particulars. And Ramanujan once again begins, you will always see, a poem on particulars is an ironic title in the sense that it is not a poem on particulars, even though he will begin with that one particular image of a wicker basket, beter basket. Wicker basket is a cane basket. In our city markets, I've often seen a wicker basket sit upon its single ample hip. Tumra wicker basket অত দেখোনি, কিন্তু ওইরকম বেতের বলতে পারো ওই এক ধরনের বাক্স আমরা দেখেছি. It's a large kind of a basket with this kind of a shape. So the hip is ample. So upon its single ample hip, it's rattan. So it's a crisscross pattern, rattan pattern filled with another subtler bubble bed pattern of oranges. So it's these bubbles where you have these ridges, they are bubble shaped and orange colored, pell-mell piled, so everything piled into them. These are baskets which are carried on the head by the people. They're carried in their hand by the people for marketing, for bringing things into the market. So they are pell-mell piled randomly, not one with a stain, some thick painted green all over, others just a fingerprint of green, some so ripe there was a hint of fungi ash on a slightly hollowed cheek, some flushed in saffron, some gamboge, some tangerines, so different colors, different flavors coming into them, some pulpy, velvet skinned, their inner fist of fingers held rather loosely, and each day more loosely in their body's grandpa grip. Now that grandpa grip, the alliteration, suggests that the wicker basket is an older kind of an object. The image is of something which belongs to the past, right? The image of the wicker basket, which is no longer carried by people. You haven't probably seen anybody carrying a wicker basket nowadays to the market. Even in Ramanujan's age, that would have been rather unusual. But it did exist. In fact, we had one in the family. And all sorts of things were piled within it. So the wicker basket is described, if you see that image in all its urgency, that single ample hip, the bubble bed pattern of oranges, the fungi ash on a slightly hollowed cheek. অর্থাৎ দেখো, what I want you to look at is how sharply etched and how consciously foregrounded the image is. If you look at the poetry of Ezra Pound, for example, which Ramanujan was deeply influenced by, Pound describes the image and says that the image is the heart of the poem, right? And the image is the one, is described for itself, right? But for Ramanujan, the image becomes a kind of a doorway through which he can then, interrogate through the Puram conditions, the linkages between the present and the past. So the wicker basket, which is, falling apart literally, is a grandpa grip. So it is linked with the past. It belongs to tradition. And then if you take this a little further, but every one of these ridges has an absurd, almost human umbilicus at the top. So it is related with humanity. It is related with individual histories, with human beings. So you see, what happens is the object, the body of the wicker basket, which is an inanimate object, gets associated not only with a human subject, but also with a particular time and history, with a particular sense of culture. So every single wicker basket tells a story of a family, as it were. But every one of these has an absurd, almost human umbilicus at the top, right? So just as, you see, the umbilicus is connected to the body, and it is the umbilicus which links you. Nabhite je nari ache tomar, right? The umbilicus links us with whom? With our mother. At the moment of birth, this umbilicus is cut. But it is always a reminder, that we have arisen from a particular individual, who is in turn have arisen from another individual, right? So the umbilical link is the link between our body and the past, right? So the wicker basket, therefore, is a larger metonymic symbol of a family where individuals are related, and that relates, the wicker basket is that image which relates the past with the present. So umbilicus at the top, where once the tree had poured its future, right? So the family tree, as it were, the parent had gifted the future from forgotten roots and possessed it close to feed this fall-minded autumnal. Fall-minded is autumnal. So the wicker basket is a symbol of a life which is dying out, a life which is at its ripeness, which is at its old age. So the wicker basket is a symbol of a tradition which is aging, which is decaying, right? So from forgotten roots and possessed it close to feed the fall-minded, pot-bellied bud. Now, you will see as you grow in years, you will not see, of course, you are, of course, now in the Byronic sense of the 2 and 20. Byron has this poem where he says, "Oh, give not to me of a name great in story. The days of our youth are the days of our glory," where you don't have to think about fat accumulating on you. But once you enter into advanced years, then automatically, the shape becomes pot-bellied. Similarly, you see, there's this human body, and there's this cultural body which has also become pot-bellied, advanced in years, autumnal in its years, till it's rounded for our baskets. So the wicker basket, this poem begins with a very defined image of the wicker basket, then moves to its analysis as a symbol of a decaying culture, which is associated with the tree, with the family tree that once breathed life into it. It's a symbol of tradition that is now decaying, but still has, its utility. And then comes, you see, the philosophical question, the Puram in the poem. I have heard it said among planters, you can sometimes count every orange on a tree, right? So you can count every orange from a tree, but never all the trees in a single orange. What a beautiful line that is, right? So within the single orange, you cannot count all the trees. So think of the orange as you and me. And within us, we are the seeds of our ancestors, as it were. But we accept and we reject. And several generations go into our making. So even if you think of it in terms of genes, you can carry a gene that is twice removed in generational terms. So if you look at yourself as an orange, which is composed of several genes, you never know from where your gene has come from which ancestor you can go back to. But the point remains that what we are, we can never be free from what we were, right? So once again, as I read in this poem, which we read in the last class, when Ramanujan writes about resembling everyone but himself, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father. You see, this is a poem which is talking about the same thing, that how the selfhood of an individual is not really utterly, free. It is always linked, like this wicker basket, with its ancestors, with the trees that go into the making of a single orange. So this link, the stitching and unstitching between tradition and modernity, the past and the present, is always a major subject. Time is a very important subject in Ramanujan. Ramanujan does not see time as very defined, that the present is the present. He's always looking at time as fuzzy, where, the present and the past are continuously sort of interposing and interplaying upon one another. And therefore, similarly, if time is fuzzed, then human identity and selfhood is also fuzzy. It cannot always free itself from the upbringing. There are poems, for example, when Ramanujan is coming to Chicago, he writes a poem where the mother says that do not forget your oil bath every Tuesday. So wherever you go, ultimately this is also a poem about the diasporic individual, that wherever the diasporic individual goes, the hyphenated identity, the ancestral wisdom, the ancestral cultures, conventions that are passed on from generation to generation are somewhere retained in that orange. So how many trees go into the making of that orange is something which Ramanujan is very skeptical about. Now, the third poem that I'm going to read today is a poem which, and therefore this is also, you will find that Ramanujan's poems, if you look at them, the poem is on particulars, on a particular wicker basket, on a particular orange, as it were. But ironically, this is not a poem on particulars. It shows that the particular is always associated with a greater general background and general phenomenon. So the operative word in Ramanujan's poetic technique, I would say, is irony. The operative poetic technique is the foregrounding of an image, and then from that image to sort of digress into various ideas and bring you back once again to that image. And there is a humor here. There's a very light, a very serio-comic kind of a humor, almost black, because the self always wants to move out of the boundaries of the father, right? The anxiety of influence, as it were, that's a phrase used by Harold Bloom, which suggests that poets can never escape the anxiety of influence, right? And therefore, they are always somewhere related with an earlier literature. And therefore, Ramanujan suggests that our selfhood, especially the Hindu Indian selfhood, is always related in some way with the past, and it can never really break forth. So is there an Indian modernity? Right? Is there an Indian modernity? And if there is an Indian modernity, how is it related with tradition? These are questions which Ramanujan is asking, right? And you can see his own poetry interlinked with the earlier poetry of the Sangam and the Alwar, as I said, the Akam and the Puram ideas. And you can see how Ramanujan himself, writing in Chicago, writing in language which is alien, writing in a language that is formal, English, he can never really escape the traditions of poetry. He can never really escape the traditions of family. He can never escape the traditions of religion. Therefore, his self-portrait is always that of stranger, right? Which is always signed at the corner by his father, right? And this is a very important theme in Ramanujan's poetry. And therefore, we come to a poem, a series of poems which Ramanujan wrote about the Hindus. And these are poems where he's far more satiric in that sense of the term. You know, this idea of the Hindu, that he is at the center of the world, he possesses second sight, that there is the element of a certain glimpse into a truth that is beyond ordinary human individuals. This trumpeting of a Brahminical Hindu tradition is, and remember that Ramanujan belonged to a Tamil Brahmin family, which incidentally is one of the most conservative castes of India. The Tamil Brahmins are very conservative, and yet they are also again very modern. This you will understand, if you've encountered a Tamil Brahmin, and it's also a paradox in the sense that he's brilliant in science, for example, but entirely devoted to his religion on the other hand, and has a lot of superstitions. Some of you probably have read the Chetan Bhagat's novel. What was it I forget, the Two States or whatever. Can somebody tell me the name? I think it is the Two States, where you have this Punjabi family and this Tamil Brahmin family coming into conflict with their own different ideas. But the Hindu, he doesn't hurt a fly or a spider either. So the Hindu is supposedly non-violent, right? And something which has been reified by the image of Gandhi as the center of Indian culture. Somebody has probably responded to what I said. Two states, right? Thank you, Anupam, for your intervention. But Ramanujan's, this poem, this series of poems, in fact, if you take a look at the Oxford Ramanujan, you'll find a series of poems which challenges these beliefs. And Ramanujan is a poet who challenged the idea that there was one Ramayana. He said that every single region, every state has its own version of Ramayanas, so that there are 300 Ramayanas in circulation. And he was always against this, monolithic Hindu culture, and this idea of the great trumpeting of Hindu culture as sort of superior to all other cultures, right? And Hinduism as something which is extremely non-violent and something which sort of begets Gandhis all across the country. He says, it's time I told you I'm so gentle, do not hurt a fly. Why I cannot hurt a spider either, not even a black widow. Now, there's an irony there. Obviously, you can understand that the black widow is not a spider which you would like to hurt at all, right? Because its bite can result in death. For who can tell who's who? Can you? Maybe it's once again my great... So, obviously, we cannot be violent because we do not know who has how much influence. So we are non-violent. Maybe it's once again my great swinging grandmother, that another playing at patience centered in his web, my one true ancestor. Now, this concept of the one true ancestor is, somewhere an extremely problematic category, as you will see here. Who is the one true ancestor? Is it the grandfather? Or is it the fisherman lover who waylaid her on the ropes in the Madras harbor, took her often from behind, imprinting on her face and body, not to speak of family tree or gossip column? So the grandmother obviously has had a colorful past, having a sexual dalliance, as it is suggested, with a local fisherman, right? Lasting impressions on his net till one day spider fashion. And this is where Ramanujan is also against the patriarchal sort of violence unleashed against the woman, where the woman is not only a subject of marital rape, but also on the streets she's accosted, till who clamped down and bit him while still inside her, as if she'd teeth her down there. They had a Latin name for it, which didn't help the poor man one bit. Once again, you notice the black macabre humor here. The man bitten while still in the act, and there being a Latin name which wouldn't help the man one single bit. And who can say I do not bear, as I do his name, the spirit of great-grandfather? So who is his ancestor? That's what he's asking. Is it his great-grandfather who is supposedly respectable, a Tamil Brahmin? Or is it this great fisherman? Or is it this fisherman who's waylaid her grandma and raped her? And is it this man? Right? That still man, untimely witness, timeless eye. And you can see once again within this debate, what Ramanujan is also inserting is also the great debate between the Arya and the Anarya, right? So, who is the ancestor? Is it the Arya, the Aryan, who has come and who claims ancestry over India and Hinduism? Or is Hinduism a faith which owes its ancestry to the people whom we consider the Anarya, whom we consider out of the periphery of the great Aryan Hindu faith? So, you see, what is happening is, through this one image of the Hindu who is non-violent, Ramanujan is entering, as it were, into the debate about the ancestry of not only the individual, but also of the nation, the great debate that was fostered upon us, as it were, about our Aryan past. And Ramanujan is suggesting that it is all very problematic because our roots might refer back to other traditions as well. So, untimely witness, timeless eye, perpetual outsider, right? So, once again, the relationship between the Hindu man and the wife, which is always one of distance rather than great proximity and intimacy. So, in a certain sense, both the fisherman and the grandfather are patriarchs in the sense that they wreak violence upon the body of the woman, are distant and completely cut off from her inner life, right? So, perpetual outsider, watching as only husbands will, a suspense of nets vibrate under wife and enemy. So, for this grandfather, great-grandfather, the fisherman is an enemy. So this conflict between the two cultures, as it were, the Aryan and the non-Aryan. So the greater debates of nationhood, of belonging and non-belonging, are, as it were, being entered into from this one image of the particular. So the poem always begins with a particular, but then it broadens out into larger debates, which every move or hand or thigh watching like some spider lover a pair of his Borneo specimens mate. So the great-grandfather is obviously a collector of animals, and he has this spidery kind of a collection, and the act of copulation of the grandma and the fisherman is, as it were, replicating the act of the spider. In murder, make love with hate, or simply stalk a local fly. So, it's this act of sexuality and the act of the great-grandfather who is filled with hate but cannot do anything, right? So Ramanujan's ultimate question is this Hindu way of life, which will be trumpeted as greatly detached and greatly non-violent, is it true at all? Or ironically, is Hindu society riveted by contradictions, conflicts, hatreds towards one another, which we gloss over with the claim that the Hindu is somebody who is non-violent, cannot hurt a fly or a spider either. Now, if you take a look at the Oxford Ramanujan, you will find that there are numerous such poems which Ramanujan writes about the violence that Hindu society wreaks upon the woman, upon the violence that, and the entire kind of ostracization of the woman's wishes, and the violent hatred which different segments, the fisherwoman and the fisherman and the great-grandfather, the different castes, the different religions may have with one another. So Ramanujan is critiquing and exploding with great irony and satire here the claim that Hindu society is non-violent and thereby great, Mera Bharat Mahan. And that idea is, as it were, something that Ramanujan is stitching and unstitching with great precision and great irony. So once again, let me fold this discussion up by having discussed three poems. What we have observed is that Ramanujan's poetic technique is almost always to foreground a certain image, which is the poem. And then from that particular image, to project into or to delve into different ideas about family and nation and culture. Right, so there are several concentric rings within Ramanujan's poetry. The innermost concentric ring is about the self, about a particular person, family, object. The innermost ring is the image. That is the center of the poem. And from there, ideas radiate out. It may radiate out to the family, it may radiate out to the country, or in certain cases, as we will see, it might radiate out to the cause of humanity at large. We will talk about Eichmann a little later. One of the poems that I've circulated is about the Holocaust and how, he will implicate all humanity within it, right? But what we need to understand in Ramanujan's poetry is this bridge between the past and the present, the bridge between the particular image and the idea, between the Akam poetry and the Puram poetry. So the poem will begin with an Akam facade of the image, and then it will move across into Puram poetry, questioning with great irony and precision the assumptions very often made in Indian Hindu society, the assumptions we make about our selfhoods, the assumptions which are made about particularities, and the assumptions which link the present with the past, with the body and nature with culture, and with the relationship between tradition and modernity. So all these poems begin with images and then broaden out into ideas. That is the operative technique within Ramanujan's poetry. So with this, with these few comments, I would like to bring this particular phase of the discussion to a close, and I will here stop the recording of this lecture.